thank you all for being here tonight. Today, I'm going to talk about what it is that I do from the moment I get a piece of music to the moment that I have to walk on stage. My friends are always telling me that I live this glamorous lifestyle of traveling and being on stage. But tonight, you're going to know the truth. You're going to know all the work that goes behind it. I've never actually heard a musician talk about this because typically we only discuss the end result, the performance, and everything before that is just what we do. It comes so naturally. I started understanding music in the womb. My mother is a piano teacher, and she did her piano master's recital at USC, 9 months pregnant with me. And apparently I responded as if I was understanding from within, so I would kick to certain styles consistently, and never to others. So music really was my first language. I started piano lessons at the age of 2. There I am. And I gave my first recital at 2 years and 9 months. My debut with orchestra and my first solo recital was when I was 9 years old. And at that time, I also took up the cello for many years. I put together a rough order of stages that I go through in preparing a piece, from looking at the music score, to getting to know the background study of the piece, to learning the notes, to the interpretation, leading to the finishing touches and the final performance. In an ideal situation for me, I would have a few months to sit with my pieces, but that's not always possible. Sometimes I have just a few days or even a few hours before I walk on stage to learn something. This year happens to be the composer Robert Schumann's 200th anniversary birthday year, and I've been asked to play his piano concerto this weekend in Indiana. So I've decided to use it to refer to and demonstrate from throughout the lecture. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term piano concerto, it's a piece of work that's written for orchestra and for piano solo. Let's start with the first stage of the timeline. A single piece of music can be printed by various publishers, and so there may be different versions and editions of the piece, such as here in the piano concerto. Here's the Kalmus edition, the Henley edition, the Schirmer edition. They may vary widely in terms of markings and even in notes. So the first thing I like to do is make sure that I have a good edition of the music, because I want the music to be as close to the composer's intentions as possible. Even better, I like to see original manuscripts if available. Looking at Schumann's original manuscript in this score, his writing gives us some insight to his personality and temperament that we wouldn't see in a regular printed score. We can see here that he really struggled to connect the second and third movements, and he scribbled things out, crossed things, erased things out. In this next slide, we can tell an interesting discovery. The handwriting of his wife and accomplished pianist Clara is present throughout the concerto. And among other things, we can tell because her stems of notes are to the right side, as shown here in red, and his stems or notes are to the left, as shown in blue. So this tells us that she had quite a bit of input into the concerto. If anything, the manuscripts are just so fascinating to see, and it triggers some questions, such as, why is he doing what he's doing here? Is that just an ink mark, or is that actually a note? Does this tell me anything about how I should play the music? Once I've obtained a good edition and have looked at the manuscripts, I go to stage 2 in my timeline, which is to look at the background information of the piece. I like to answer a set of questions that might help shed light on how a composer may have wanted his piece to be played. So who is this composer? When was the piece written? What was going on in his personal life? Are there any writings about the piece from the composer? What were the reactions at the premiere of the piece? Were there any reactions in newspaper reviews? From my research, I know that Schumann was a tormented man. He was tormented by depression, he had alter egos, and he was pronounced insane. He wrote this concerto in 1845, which was a prolific period of time in his life. This is when he wrote the Second Symphony, a couple song cycles, and he wrote quite a few romances as well. And so we also know that not long before the concerto, he had just married his beloved Clara, after a very long and arduous battle for her, though. So I'm ultimately here to act as a bridge from the composer to the music, and the more I know of the composer, then the more personal connection I have with the notes. Once I have a pretty good idea of the background of the piece, then I'm finally able to sit at the piano to learn the notes. And this is when I practice, practice, practice. After all, that's how you get to Carnegie Hall, right? These days, I just try to get to the piano whenever I possibly can, and the number of hours depends greatly on my schedule. So, for instance, today I was preparing for an important lecture. Tomorrow I'm teaching all day. Wednesday I'm traveling on a plane all day. So a lot of times I'll study my scores visually because I can hear all of the notes in my head. So that works too. I can do a lot away from the piano. And apparently, while I'm sleeping, my fingers are always moving. I guess you would call that sleep practicing. But I have noticed that sometimes when I wake up, things are fixed that I had problems with the previous day. When I do practice at the piano, it's the time to almost obsessively scrutinize the music analytically and musically, ask questions, experiment with ideas and sounds, and then put my music back together. It's like an English paper that you get back from your teacher full of red marks. You want to edit and edit it again until it's the best version of how you want to present it. I have only maybe 5 times in my life practiced about 9 hours a day. And that was when I was preparing for international piano competitions, and they required 5 stages of memorized music, which was about 5 hours of memorized music in my hands. But in general, I don't see that much time at the piano as too healthy, because this routine repetition causes my brain to just go on autopilot, and I lose that mental power to be creative. Also, people ask, how can you get hurt playing the piano? Well, a lot of great pianists have had to end their careers early because of permanent physical damage like focal dystonia or tendinitis or carpal tunnel syndrome. Even though we're not using our bodies like athletes exactly, our bodies are hard at work for long hours, but we don't have those physical therapists and masseuses. In terms of how I hone my technique, it's very unusual that I never did much scales or technical exercises even as a child. My first teacher didn't like the idea of separating technique and music. Music should always guide the fingers and not vice versa, meaning that what I hear in my head should tell my fingers what to do versus my fingers playing and then the music coming out. So instead of chromatic scale exercises or arpeggio exercises, I would play pieces that address these technical issues. So for instance, I might play The Flight of the Bumblebee because it addresses chromaticism. Or instead of arpeggio exercises, I would play Chopin's Etude. Okay. Now, my thoughts on interpretation. Unlike a painting which inspires by its very presence, music comes to life only through the performer's interpretation. It's obvious that when you learn a piece of music, you want the correct notes to be there. I mean, you don't want to be okay with something like this. It sounds pretty good. Now, that's an extreme example, but the basic idea is that the fundamental material must be there. And too often, people put prime importance on accuracy, thinking that if you play all the right notes, that means it's perfect. But this word perfection doesn't quite fit into the nature of music, because music's so subjective. And unlike math, there's not just one final answer. What one person hears as bliss can really be someone else's agony. A machine can play Bach's music much faster and accurately than Glenn Gould ever did, but it wouldn't give me that same chill down the spine. It's like in cooking or baking. We can all have the ingredients for apple pie, but it's what we do with it and what we add to it that makes it special. And I think every successful artist is so because he has something to say and has a mind of his own. So let's take the 8 notes of the basic scale. Anyone can play these 8 notes. But what is it that you're trying to say? What are you trying to convey? Like in poetry, you wouldn't pronounce every word the same, so it is the same in music. Now let's listen to 4 legendary pianists play the same piece, the 5th variation of Johann Sebastian Bach's famous Goldberg variations. This is Rosalind Turek. Turek has a very deliberate sound, solid touch, giving each note meaning, and lets the music speak for itself. Now let's listen to Andras Schiff. There's a much lighter touch here, almost off the key. Now Glenn Gould. This is very brisk, but there's fanatic energy and clarity in each of the fingers. Now Wilhelm Kempff. It's almost sustained, almost a bit lyrical. Okay, so there are quite a few differences among the 4, but they're all great performances. In fact, our own views are always changing. Just like Picasso had different stages of paintings in different stages of his life, such as seen here before 1901 to after 1945, so do musicians. Let's listen to Glenn Gould play the first variation of the same piece, first when he's 19 years old, and then when he's 49 years old. This is when he was 19. This shows a very young, energetic Gould by way of speed and clarity. Now let's listen to it when he's 49. It's much more grounded in tempo, but that energy is still there, but just in the articulation and control of the fingers. Okay? And it's okay to have numerous interpretations of one piece. It is, as long as we know what is laid out by the composer and we understand the boundaries of a responsible interpretation. Why do artists have such varied interpretations? Well, to start with the obvious answer, we're all made very differently, so even if we tried to play the same, it would be very difficult. The last 2 teachers that I had were heftier men with sausage-like fingers, and what worked for them didn't work for me. When they played the music of Johannes Brahms, they just used the weight of their hands and their arms, and they got this enormous sound. I would have to use my back muscles and my ab muscles to get the same sound. And alternately, they would be envious of my little fingers, gliding down the keyboard in a fast passage. We are the sum of our musical experiences, including the music we've heard on the radio, in concerts, at our earliest lessons, and all these experiences influence us. I know that a big part of my development as a musician is the different teaching styles and traditions to which I've been exposed. I was lucky to study with a great variety of pedagogues that include Italian, Russian, German, and American traditions and methods. All of these styles and methods differ slightly. For instance, some teachers say that you want to play with this fatty part of the finger, and some say you should only play with the tip. Some say you want to pull at this key. Some say you want to push into the key. And some say that your wrist should be pretty low. And some say you want to play with a high wrist. Vera Gornostayeva, the great Russian pedagogue, she talked about the misconception that in order to create a sustained legato sound, that you have to keep your fingers on the keyboard, such as this in my right hand. But she argues that you can make just as beautiful a sound by releasing the notes. And then she even shows me this by using the back of a pencil eraser. Okay. Some teachers would be appalled by her technique. My view is to hear first what kind of sound I want, and then use whichever kind of way to do it, because one method just can't possibly work for everyone. And a very special part of being a musician is having that ability to teach and to discover for ourselves. Now, the interpretation stage is the most time-consuming stage in the timeline. Let's look at just some of the countless things I might interpret while learning a piece of music. Tempo, or speed. Dynamics, or volume. Style, melody, harmony, rhythm, pedaling, phrasing, articulation, voicing, ornaments, silence, and many, many more. I wish we could cover all of these things, but we'd be here all night. So let's go over just a few of the more basic elements together. Tempo, dynamics, style, voicing, and silence. Looking at the first page of Schumann's concerto, we see a couple of indications. Allegro affettuoso, or lively or fast and with tenderness and feeling. And this F here for forte, strong or loud. So this is an example of indications laid out by the composer, but that still leave a little bit of room for interpretation. In some cases, there's a more specific metronome marking, such as here, half note equals 84. This is the indication that Schumann himself put in the manuscript. Those of you who are not familiar with the metronome, it's a fantastic mechanism to practice with, but it's not something that you want to follow from the first to the last note, because music always breathes in a way that's completely foreign to a machine. Now let's give this 84 a try. Now, some pianists may very well go with that tempo, but for me it doesn't leave room for the music to breathe. And there's a certain stateliness in the opening that's lost, I think, at that speed. And of course the affettuoso is missing. So for me, I hear it a little bit more like this. Okay. And some editors will change the marking to 69. Because writings have shown that Schumann was guessing about his tempo markings, and that some of his tempo markings are so fast that they're unplayable. When asked about his unusual tempos, Schumann once replied, "Are they wrong? I never thought of testing them with a machine." So, if for no other reason, I like to try different tempi around the general metronome marking, and find one that sits most comfortably with me technically and musically. And as you can see from the four pianists who played Bach earlier, each of them had a different tempo, and each was convinced that theirs was the only true one. And I think that's what's most important, is that I as a performer am convinced of what I'm doing. Now back to the score. Seeing this dynamic level, such as forte, doesn't mean there's only one type of forte. What context is it in? Well, here an orchestra of 70 to 80 people will play a forte first chord in unison before I come in. So my forte is going to have to be pretty healthy and hefty so that I don't risk being muffled or sound really tiny compared to the orchestra, especially in a big hall too. Also, something else to consider. A normal forte back in Schumann's day is not a normal forte today. His audiences never heard Mahler, Shostakovich, car horns, rock music, and even the instrument Schumann was composing on was smaller. The piano has gone through several changes since before the 14th century clavichord. In this slide we see the harpsichord, clavichord, forte piano, spinet, the modern grand piano, and some other variations. Today's pianos are larger in size, they have a bigger range, and they're more easily controlled in volume, sustain, and action repetition. The harpsichord has a very metallic sound because a small quill plucks the string, and it sounds like this. The clavichord doesn't sound too much different. Now, instead of plucking, in today's piano, a hammer strikes the string, which causes the string to vibrate, which makes the air move. And these vibrations are amplified by the soundboard in the piano, which finally makes its way to our ears. So as we start moving to the forte piano, it starts to sound a little bit more like our grand piano of today. This is the Haydn Adagio. We'll hear it in a second, played by the modern grand piano, and this is the forte piano. Okay, and then this is the modern piano playing that same thing. It's much warmer, much more fuller tones, and that tinniness is gone. Okay, when Beethoven was composing, the forte piano that he was composing on was too limited for what he wanted to do, and he wanted louder, more powerful pianos. So this brings up this philosophical question. Did the composers of the past want their music now to sound exactly as it did back then, or did they expect their music to be updated with new stylistic eras? I suppose it's kind of like questions we might have about something like the US Constitution. How does a changing world affect the meaning? Do we interpret this in the context of when it was written or in the present? Both the Constitution and Mozart's famous Eine kleine Nacht music were both have been interpreted in so many different ways since they were written in 1787. What's great about music, though, is that I can do whatever I want. I can play Mozart one day as I may have thought the composer would have played it, and the next day I can do a postmodern deconstruction of the piece. Now, if the composer is living, I will of course try to get the opportunity to speak with him or her about his piece. I was able to get some perspectives from two great composers of today, Dr. Frank Felice and our Chapman's own Dr. Jeff Holmes. I performed Dr. Frank Felice's piece entitled Awakening's Winter recently, and I didn't get a chance to meet or speak with him before I performed it. My approach to the piece was just to think of the chill and the sounds of winter and to experiment with very still, feather-like sounds. When I met him after the performance, he said that I played it exactly the way he heard it in his head. And he said it's a rare thing because typically he worries whether he's communicated enough on paper to allow performers to play it the way he hears it in his head. And he realizes that out of 150 performances, he may not like 98 of them. According to our own Dr. Jeff Holmes, I like it if two different performers come up with different solutions to interpretive issues. My pieces are open as far as the expression of the performer's individual personality or the particular moment. So a piece may vary emotionally from performer to performer, as well as performance to performance. I think this applies to my music as well as to traditionally notated music of the past. Now, let's go back to the interpretive elements and look at style. Just like there's an audible difference between tango, salsa, R&B, rap, I need to make the styles within classical music very distinct. All of these styles, romantic, baroque, classical, contemporary, sound very different from one another. So let's just take two styles as an example, classical and romantic. The music of Franz Joseph Haydn is of the earlier classical style, so I know I'm aiming generally for a lighter, clearer texture and a basically uniform tempo, like this. And then the music of Gabriel Fauré, which is of the late Romantic period, I know has more fluid lines, longer melodies, and more freedom in the tempo and in the use of pedals, like this. You can hear a clear difference between the two styles. And you wouldn't want to play Haydn like this. Or Fauré like this. It's just not right. Okay? Now, I know I might get asked about the pedals if I don't say anything about them. This right pedal is to sustain the sound of all of the keys. Okay? The middle pedal is just to hold down one of the keys, and the left pedal will mute all of the keys slightly. I always say to pedal with the ears, because the ears will tell you if something is blurred when it's not supposed to, like in this theme of Schumann. Okay, it's all blurred together. The ears will tell your foot when to change. And then maybe I'll use a soft pedal here for a change of the color. Okay? Now, voicing in piano is basically treating each finger in a chord as if it's a separate voice. So if I have chord here, I may want to put a little bit more weight on the pinky. Or I may want to put a little bit more weight on the left-hand third finger. Okay? I can play the opening of the Schumann melody with each finger having the same amount of pressure, but it would sound very one-dimensional, like this. Okay, but when I voice it, I begin to hear different colors and different dimensions. So for me, I want more sparkle on the top of the melody at the beginning, and then maybe halfway through it, I want this little line in the left hand to come out. Okay, so it's like a conversation between the fingers, and every pianist will voice just slightly differently depending on how they hear it. Silence, also called rests in music, is often overlooked. They're not just waiting periods. Rests are one of the colors on the composer's palette. Arthur Schnabel said, "The notes I handle no better than many pianists, but the pauses between the notes, that's where the art resides." I must decide how long I want the length of silences, the magnitude of the silence to create anticipation, tension, and release. The following is a clip of the climactic build in Barber's Adagio for strings. At the end of the build, there's a rest, and this is where the most intensity is. It's what creates that effect of the material that follows it. Now, during rests, some musicians just relax, or they start the next material prematurely. And this is why you've seen some audiences clap in the middle of a piece, because the artist didn't hold them until the next note. Okay? So those are just some of the ways that we might interpret 5 of the elements. And there are many, 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 many more that I would spend time interpreting. What am I thinking, feeling on stage during performance? Well, some people have synesthesia. They see different colors when they hear pitches. Some people think analytically, tonic 1 chord, dominant 5 chord. I hear very clearly pitches and interval relationships because of the perfect pitch I have. So since birth, I could tell you the pitch of anything immediately. C sharp, B, G sharp, A, E, in between. And that doesn't apply just to the piano. It's also to the light buzzing or the fire alarm going off. I don't know how not to hear those pitches. But more so than hearing analytically or in terms of pitches, in the music I hear and feel emotions. So whereas someone might feel a dominant 5 chord going to a tonic 1 chord, I feel relief at an arrival. It's not something I do consciously. It's just that different chords represent different moods to me. There was a clever little video that came out a while ago in France that illustrates what I'm talking about. In this clip, this Roman numeral represents the chord symbol in this key of F sharp minor, and then the stick figure shows the mood that is associated with the particular chord. This is Mozart's Piano Concerto, K488 slow movement. So we can see that the 1 and 2 chords represent sadness and gloom. But then there are occasional chords like the 6 and the 7 and the 3 that present hope. Back to the unsettled feeling. The musicians out there will appreciate the unexpected Neapolitan chord. Okay. Now, when there is some kind of stylistic association or programmatic element associated with a piece, then that's what I'll absorb myself in. So for instance, if I'm playing the music of Maurice Ravel, then I'll think of a painting of Claude Monet, because they're both from the Impressionist period, which emphasized atmosphere more than anything else. Okay. Or take the second piano trio of Dmitri Shostakovich. He wrote this in 1944, inspired by the devastations of the Holocaust. And some of his themes were even responses specifically to the horrors of the victims having to dance on their own graves. So I know I am not supposed to be playing anything beautiful here. Instead, I'm supposed to be playing something that sounds sadistic, full of pain, almost destructive. Okay, so I'll immerse myself in the music story, and I try to channel that however I possibly can. Now, let's go back to the concerto and discuss how I might translate Schumann's feelings into the music. We know that Schumann was this tormented man, and he asked Clara's father time and time for permission to marry him. And he would always reply, "I don't want to waste my daughter on a penniless composer." And he also had alter egos that wavered between struggles and triumph. And at one point, he attempted suicide by throwing himself into the Rhine River. So I take whatever associations I have from my own life to what he was experiencing, and I try to channel that into the music. We've all been lovesick, depressed, and slightly crazy, haven't we? And when I play like an actor, I do absorb myself in those feelings and roles so much that I become it. And I have cried on stage while playing because the emotions have been so powerful. I remember when I was 8 years old or so working on the G minor ballade of Chopin, and my teacher said to me, "I hope that something tragic happens to you one day." I wasn't quite sure of her intentions then, but I realized later that she just wanted me to be able to access those feelings when I needed to. Now let's take a look at the cadenza of the concerto. The cadenza is that passage at the end of the movement when the pianist will typically play by himself and sometimes improvises, but in this case it's written out by Schumann. The notes alone play out like this of the first line. Okay, to me this first phrase exhibits quite a bit of pain for a couple of different reasons. Not only are we in minor mode, but we're descending on the keyboard lower and lower. representing the downward spiraling of his despair. And in terms of voicing, Schumann writes a two-note figure that represents the size of his pleadings. So he writes, ah, ah, please, ah. So I want to voice to those notes to make them audible in the texture. I also hear the alter egos talking on top of each other, almost interrupting each other. So like the fluctuations of emotions, in the music we can move forward or pull back when we need to. It shouldn't be metronomic. The second line starts this sequence of the melody that repeats 4 times. Once, twice, you get the picture. So the harmonies will change how I color the sound because I don't want them to be exactly the same, even though they are the same. So I hear it as this, as Schumann saying, "Will she be mine? Maybe she'll be mine. But what if she won't be mine? Oh, she'll never be mine." And the music becomes darker and darker. And then at this point, the other voice comes in with words of determination and triumph, saying, "I am going to win her hand in marriage." Okay. After this, the haunting opening melody returns. But this time, there is an extended trill on top. And to me, this trill symbolizes that madness that's going on in his head. And this section acts as a point of climax, utmost desperation. Near the end of the cadenza, there is one last build to the highest note of the cadenza, this B flat. And during the ascent, we hear again the sigh figure. Ah, please. Ah, ah. All the way to the B flat. And when we get there, it deserves just a little bit of time because it's a point of realization for him, whatever that may be. So putting it all together, one performance is only one step of the process. There's going to be much more to do and more details to come, no matter how many times I've played something. So, as you can see in the big picture, the notes are the easy part of it, the learning process. The really difficult part that takes years and years and relentless dedication is everything else in between. Michelangelo said, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." And that's what we need to do with the music. By the time I get to the 5th stage, my piece has typically already memorized itself. I've heard endless stories of how people memorize, and again, everyone has their own method, whether it's orally, visually, kinesthetically, by repetition, or by rewriting the music note for note by memory, or a combination of all of those things. I was once asked to replace a soloist last minute, and in 1 month I had to open the score for the first time to Rachmaninoff's 3rd piano concerto, which is about 45 minutes long. Learn, memorize, and perform it. For that particular piece, I wish I had at least a year. And I can tell you that the week after the performance, I literally could not remember how to play the first 3 of the 70 or so pages because it was forced into my memory, my short-term memory. So I think memorization should never be a forced process. 1 week before a performance, I like to play my pieces through for colleagues and other musicians because it's always nice to have another set of ears for ideas and suggestions. And it's a good time to make sure that my ideas are coming across audibly to the listener, because even though it's obvious to me what I'm doing, it may not come across to the people out there. I'll also record myself, because for some reason when I listen to myself, I'm 100 times more critical than I normally am. Hearing myself rush is much worse than hearing somebody else tell me that I'm rushed. And I can't stand it to the point that it's fixed immediately. So once I've covered these steps, I'm almost ready to go on stage. Do I get nervous? Short answer is yes. There's always some nerves when I play, some performances more than others. The nature of performing is very difficult because it puts 2 very opposite forces at work together. On one hand, we have to be on top form, our muscles and our accuracy and our focus 100%. But on the other hand, we need to be completely free, our emotions open, spontaneous. Sometimes you only see one version, a very stiff interpretation, but that's very accurate. Or you see a very passionate and moving performance, but that's just all over the place. Performing is really at least 50% mental, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard a pianist say, "It was perfect every time I played it at home. What happened on stage?" When I was in the 4th round of the international Leeds competition, I was exhausted and I was sick, but I still had to play. And so I remember I walked on stage and I bowed and I sat at the piano, and for the life of me I couldn't remember what the first note to Rachmaninoff's 2nd Sonata was. So I sat there and I sat there, and I'm sure the audience was thinking, what is going on? So, I just decided to just throw my hands on the keyboard, and luckily my tactile memory kicked in and the fingers just started moving. But being on stage is a completely different monster from just playing at home, and it's not like being in a recording studio where you can do many different takes. Once I start the first note, it's see you at the end, hopefully. I have one chance in front of thousands of people and critics listening and watching just on me. I have had sweaty palms that slipped off the fingers, cold fingers that just don't want to move, trembling hands, and these are things that all come with it. Instead of being shocked by it every time, I just expect, accept, and work with it. And then there are those unexpected things that happen, like when my dress has snapped on stage, or when a spider really has crawled across my neck while I was playing. But I just have to continue on, because audiences have paid a ticket price. And doesn't matter if I have 105-degree temperature, I'm sick to my stomach, jet-lagged, or playing on a piano that's in horrendous condition. The audience should never know that, and I should always give my 100%. So over the years, I just learned some tricks to keep it together. I sometimes soak my hands in hot water, or I'll put baby powder on my fingers to prevent the slipperiness, do some simple meditation. Many musicians take prescription beta blockers to decrease their heart rate and prevent anxiety on stage. I don't do that not only because it seems a little dangerous, but I also imagine that if you take it once, you'll want to take it every time. And I do want to feel everything that I'm doing. But everyone knows what works for them. The thing that I accept is that no matter how I play, somebody's not going to like it. But the important thing to me is that somebody will, and somebody might even be touched by it. My duty is to the music, and if I can do my best to convey what I want to share, then I'll be okay, because performance is an act of communication rather than a self-demonstration. As you know, I'm not always on stage alone. In terms of playing chamber music or playing with an orchestra, I have to listen very differently. Not only am I listening to myself, which is challenging already, but I also have to listen to everyone else that I'm playing with. And we try to come together with this goal of representing the composer with a single voice. With a smaller group like this, the piano quintet, it's easy to get together, rehearse, and come up with similar ideas. But if I'm playing a concerto, I clearly can't rent nor afford an orchestra to practice with me at home. So one of the things I'll do is study the orchestral score. So for instance, take this slow part of Schumann. Then I know now the score tells me that the clarinet is playing. And then I try to play off of him and match him in tone when I come back in. Okay. There are recordings with just the orchestra part to practice with, but I think they should only be used once or twice, because realistically, you never know what the orchestra will sound like. And typically, I'd be interacting with the orchestra rather than just following them. What is beneficial about these recordings, though, is becoming orally familiar with when in the dialogue I need to play and what instruments to expect. I'll demonstrate a clip for you in a little bit. When all is said and done, and all of the elements are in place, the feeling that I'm feeling inside is hard to describe. It's like my body and my mind are in complete harmony, and my soul is soaring. And I feel very centered. It's almost a very spiritual experience. In the end, I always play best when I'm inspired, whether it is something tragic, or hiking up the highest mountain, or being in love, or sitting by the ocean side. There's always an extra magic that's there when I'm deeply moved by something, and there's no better way to channel it than through music. I've noticed that as artists get older, they seem to be able to say a lot more in their playing much more simply. There's an ease there that's as if the ego has been let go. When we're young, we're very worried about what everyone thinks of us, and we're worried about the wrong notes. But as one gets older, it's almost as if those little things don't matter. There's more important things. Leonard Bernstein said, "The only way I have of knowing I've done a really remarkable performance is when I lose my ego completely and become the composer. I have the feeling that I'm creating the piece, writing the piece on stage, just making it up as I go. For me, the biggest fault a performer can make is to be boring. I'd rather hear a piece where I completely disagree with the interpretation than to hear a performance that's unmoving, because the former would at least be a fresh approach to the work, and there's always something to learn from that." Beethoven says it best, "To play a wrong note is insignificant. To play without passion is inexcusable." I know some of you know what it's like to sit in the concert hall and hear great music. We forget the tribulations of our day. Something happens. You look around and the energy and the reaction of the crowd is contagious, and even the wrong notes are exciting. We change just because of the music we listen to, and we leave refreshed, exalted, and inspired. I think that's the only way people will crave live performance and keep classical music alive. It's not a secret that the profession of classical music is not in the greatest state financially. There are more and more students in conservatories and less jobs in the market. Their tickets for live concerts can't compete with 99-cent downloads on iTunes. There's a particular age group that makes up most of the audiences today. So who's going to be the audiences of the next decades? In this noisy, fast-paced, technology-driven world, how can we expect a generation of kids without music and arts in public schools to listen to anything other than pop? So musicians have to evolve as society evolves, and I think classical music will have to learn to understand itself in a new way, and in the way it presents itself to the world, without losing integrity to the music. It just means we can't afford to be infuriated if there's clapping or coughing in between movements. And we can't be stuffy and demand only formal dress codes, especially if we want to welcome the younger generation. I know I'm starting to present classical music in so many contemporary ways and forms, from performing live works with Chapman's incredible dance department, to working with Oscar-nominated Mike Figgis, who shot me in a classical music video, to performing with the live cast of Sesame Street, to working with designers such as Jimmy Choo and the Ferragamos, who are classical music supporters, to coaching vocals and recording a CD with Ari Shapiro, NPR White House correspondent, who steps off Air Force One with President Obama and goes directly to the recording studio with me. It's an exciting time for the arts to join together in this new era. I feel so lucky for what I do. It's not a 9-to-5, 5-day-a-week job for me. It's more like a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week lifestyle, and it's really in my blood. It is true that the life of a solo pianist can be one that's very lonely, spending hours alone with this wonderful box of wood and strings, traveling alone, staying in hotels alone. But when I go to a foreign country where I don't understand the language at all, the music really does bring me home, and it also connects me with people from all over the world. Playing such incredible music and feeling the response and energy of those who appreciate it make it all worth it. This is that debatable orchestral recording that I mentioned earlier, playing the end of Schumann's concerto, which shows him at his absolute happiest, the realization that Clara is finally his wife. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Major funding for this program was provided by Chapman University.